One thing that a visitor will notice immediately if they can get a little bit of altitude, a couple stories up in an office building or an apartment building, even on top of one of Sacramento's handful of hills like this one, Poverty Ridge, is that Sacramento from the air looks like a forest with a city jutting out of it.
As you know, this is one of the most beautiful, I think it's the most beautiful state capital in the whole wide world.
Sacramento, center of California state government, an historic city that grew and prospered from the days of the gold rush.
Start with the state capital.
But they tell me you should have seen it 100 years ago. The Valley of the Sacramento.
You're in Sacramento, a wonderful town.
Sacramento.
Sacramento.
Sacramento. Sacramento. Sacramento. Sacramento and capital city.
As the western terminus for the railroad, Sacramento was one of the most important cities in the United States.
The city of Sacramento is a very old city.
Sacramento. Sacramento's historic past.
It's wonderful to be in Sacramento.
A wonderful town. Sing, sing, sing.
City of trees.
City of trees.
Showcase the trees.
Plant a tree.
City of trees.
Trees are really a way to bring neighborhoods and communities together.
More trees.
5 million trees planted.
City of trees.
It's an amazing story, sure. I think it's one of my favorite stories. It's a story I can really relate to and think about. As the settlers came over the hill, I imagine myself, I'm a skier, so I've come over that hill many, many times, and I've seen the forest in many different ways. And I can't imagine what it would have been like for the settlers to come over and not see any of the trees that are there now. Most of them weren't there. They've all been planted by people, and I think that that's absolutely incredible.
City of Plains. So how do we go from the City of Plains to the City of Trees? It's real interesting. I know you just got to know, so I'm going to tell you.
Sacramento was at the upper part of a vast region called the Delta, which was largely tule, periodically flooded, full of strings of trees in some areas. Nothing at all like it is now.
The title City of the Plains just came from the fact that we're in the middle of a large river valley.
I do have a vision, certainly out in this area would have been rolling hills, small hills, clay, hardpan, dry grasses in the summer, and magnificent oak trees.
The oak trees would largely follow the water.
Yeah. Initially, I think reading the history books, what the first pioneers did is cut down all the oaks, cut them down for wood for the ships moving back and forth up and down the river, and to clear the land for agriculture.
They provided both shade and food, so they were very much a part of the landscape that was essential to the Nisenan people for their sustenance, for their supplies, for everything about their life. And within a few years of the gold rush, that was all gone. Either had been plowed up for fields or burned up in campfires or sawn up for Sacramento's original supply of lumber. But it became pretty apparent shortly after we had gotten rid of all those original valley oaks that trees were essential for life here just because it gets so darn hot.
One reason I think Sacramento is a city of trees is pretty obvious. It was hot and dry in the summer. What do you want? You want trees to cool things down.
By the mid-1930s, Sacramento had this enormous canopy, in part because in the mid to late 19th century, we had to set up shade trees in order to provide some respite from Sacramento's heat.
Unlike the forests of the East, someone had done this. People planted these trees for us.
That's what's so incredible. Most urban forests in this country were removed for people to move into, right? So when you look on the East Coast, people moved there, they saw these beautiful trees, and they said, oh, great, now we have something to build our houses with. So we're gonna remove those trees. And I love the fact that in Sacramento, that's completely the opposite. People came here and said, there's no way we can live here. So let's start making that forest so that it is so beautiful.
In an era with no air conditioning, the only way to keep cool is by jumping in the river or by finding some shade. And a house doesn't quite do the job. Trees provide passive shade that cools buildings as well as allowing people walking on the sidewalk to stay cooler. It's energy efficient, it's useful, and it was brought here primarily by folks from New England. That's why a lot of Sacramento's early trees are primarily New England varieties, those found in the northeastern United States, because that's what the arborists who came to Sacramento were most familiar with.
So it all started when John Sutter laid out his grid for a city here. And it was hot, and he required a tree to be planted on every lot.
Our street design is very much on the New England pattern, the kind that you find in the northeastern corner of the United States, because a lot of our original settlers from there. So the houses are close set, they're narrow and close together on small lots. But unlike New England, where the houses are right next to each other in solid rows with party walls to share heat, in Sacramento you want to keep things cool, so they're separated with enough space to allow the planting of trees that shade the houses. That helps insulate them, helps keep them cool in the summer months, and then in the winter deciduous trees shed, and so that provides a little more light to heat the homes in winter months.
Well, there is a whole history of trees in Sacramento, and they brought in eucalyptus in the 1870s, I believe, from Australia, and they were thought that to be able to suck the moisture out of the ground and dry out the city as well as to provide shade. So there was quite extensive tree planting in the late 1800s. You know, they planted trees because there were not all that many trees, and the trees that were here were cut down to use as firewood or building structures. But they realized they needed the shade, and they wanted to protect and dry out the city because it was flood prone.
A lot of trees were brought here for their visual properties or because of their perceived utility. Eucalyptus was planted in California prodigiously because it had a strong scent, and a lot of people believe that bad smells cause disease. So, for example, they were planted alongside the Southern Pacific shops. The problem with eucalypts is that they're a real fire hazard, and they tend to go up in flames very quickly, especially if surrounded by industrial machinery, and so they were removed there and a lot of other places because of the risk of fire.
So the elms were real popular around the turn of the century. And of course they thrived before Dutch elm disease, and now we struggle with that in a big way to keep our old elms alive. A lot of them are approaching 100 years, and you know, they're at the end of their lifespan. 100 and 110 years is getting right close to the end for an elm.
The neighborhood of Oak Park originally had a park in its center just called Oak Park, and that was because of the grove of oaks that was on the farm that was subdivided to make that neighborhood. It was later converted into an electric park, an amusement park called Joyland, and after Joyland burned, that's when it was acquired by the McClatchy family, who provided it to the city of Sacramento on the condition that they rename it McClatchy Park, in part because of their founder's love of trees.
And I think one of my most favorite things when I learned that C.K. McClatchy, he liked to talk about Sacramento as being the Paris of the Pacific. And I always thought, oh, right, it's another thing you want to tell people, hey, I live in the Paris of the Pacific. That's awesome. What a great place to live.
I think it started around 1935. We declared that this city perhaps had more trees per capita, I guess, than Paris. I think that that's undisputed at this point.
McClatchy family, the owners of the Sacramento Bee, took an interest in trees.
He was a huge tree fanatic. And he would put stories about trees, the importance of trees, all in the newspaper all the time. If a big tree died or got killed, he'd have an obituary about that tree.
And then in the early 1900s, there were some pretty massive windstorms that blew over a lot of trees, and many of these were large elm trees, eucalyptus, and that caused a tremendous amount of damage. At the same time, they had been widening the roads and cutting the roots of the trees, which made them more susceptible to toppling.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were at a meeting with the city recently, and you've probably seen this very famous historical photo. It's when many of the elms on one street, I'm not sure what street it was, but came down after a storm. And it's an old photo. It's really mind-blowing because these gigantic trees are all laying on their side. And the urban forester at the city said to me, well, you know why that is? And I said, well, I mean, no, I don't really know. He said, because it was just 6 months prior that they laid the street down. So they had cut all of the roots on one side of those trees. That's why they went down. It wasn't that the storm was so horrible, it's that they really ruined those trees' connection to the ground, right? So they couldn't withstand probably very much wind at all.
So really the history of the urban forest is really a response to crisis. And we learn from each mistake that we make.
And it's something that I love to tell people. When I talk to people about the Tree Foundation, about what we do and why we do it, I almost always start there, because for most people, it's a huge aha. They just think that trees belong in Sacramento, have been here forever, and will be here forever. And that's a great place to start, because what we're trying to tell people all the time is they may not be here forever.
The DNA of the Sacramento Tree Foundation's beginning is a fascinating story. It all started back, surprisingly to me when I thought about it for a long time, back to 1978. Though we weren't formed in 1982. 1978, the voters of California passed Proposition 13, which pretty much froze the upper property tax at 1% across the board.
The people voted for 13 by 65%.
The effects were immediate. The city budget was cut, if I remember correctly, by about 16%. Park and Recreation took a big cut.
It didn't take long for things to start not looking very well. And then people would say, well, you'd be told on one hand by the county you can't touch it, that's a street tree, but the county said we have no responsibility anymore because we don't have the money, and you had a real black hole going in for a number of years on the street trees.
Fast forward 3 years, the mayor of Sacramento, Phil Eisenberg.
I'm Mayor Phil Eisenberg. Welcome to Sacramento.
The County Board of Supervisors Chair, Isla Collin.
Isla was a member of the Board of Supervisors for, a bazillion years, and she was chair when all this started. And she contributed an awful lot of energy, enthusiasm, and muscle to leverage the county staff.
They signed a joint letter, sent it to 300 civic and business and community leaders to come to a meeting in the mid-afternoon at the Sacramento Convention Center. And there they proposed that we, the community, start the Sacramento Tree Foundation as a private nonprofit group.
Well, for me, it started in Jerusalem, as a matter of fact. I think it was in 1977.
That early.
We were in Jerusalem on a mayor's tour, but we'd heard about the Israeli National Fund. And I kind of reflected on Sacramento, well, like its trees. So we came back, and Isla and I can't remember, but I think she jointly signed a letter with me raising money so Sacramento would make a gift of, $3,000 to plant trees in Israel. But out of that came the realization that we didn't have anything in Sacramento. And so by 1981, Isla and I had kind of formed some kind of a meeting to talk about doing something for trees. And I don't think it was any more specific than that.
Phil called me when he got back from Israel, and he said, "Are you still interested in the trees?" I said, "I certainly am."
Trees are our legacy. They're the signature of Sacramento.
And Sacramento's got a lot of them around, maybe not well thought out, but a lot of them around. And the chance to build something new and different was important, and that led to the foundation.
And we were incorporated on March 7th. We had a 5-year plan. We were going to plant, amazingly, a tree a day, 400 trees that year, and 400 trees the next year for the next 5 years.
And the first year you planted how many?
Well, the first year we planted our 400, but shortly thereafter we were planting thousands.
We had a lot of fun and persevered. And Ray was our first person we hired to do the tree planting.
Sacramento, I think, has always been recognized as having one of the best urban forests in the United States, in the world. And I think that's because, that just has Ray's fingerprint all over it.
Lived in Sacramento for 18 years, and I love the trees. I love this park because it's got the shade, and the trees make it wonderful to have the nice shady mornings when we're out for a run with the dog.
We call Sacramento the big city compared to Auburn, and I really do. This is a piece of home because there's so many trees everywhere.
many times for people when you talk to them about Sacramento, right? Transplants, natives, everybody recognizes the tree canopy that is what makes this city special.
So if there's an image that reflects our reputation as the city of trees, it's that aerial view. We're the city in the forest more than the city of trees. The fact that the forest, the urban forest, expands out to this massive city, continues along our riverfronts, which are still pretty wild, even though some of them aren't exactly natural, and continue all the way to the heart of the urban core. We're less than a mile from the Capitol. We're close to the business district, close to freeways, but you still look around and this still strikes the visitor as a tree-lined streetscape that you could have seen 100 years ago, and it didn't look all that much different. 19th century neighborhoods were designed to use passive energy and passive cooling. The tall, skinny houses that you see in the neighborhoods of that era are designed so heat goes upwards using what's called the stack effect and draw natural ventilation from the ground, as well as landscaping to reduce heat impact. Then after World War II, as power gets cheaper and cheaper and more abundant, air conditioning becomes a new invention that changes things radically. That's also a period of Sacramento's greatest horizontal and population expansion after World War II.
Right after World War II, much of Sacramento was populated. I can't remember, but I vaguely have a recollection of a couple of 100,000, 300,000 Modesto ash trees planted with subdivision activity around Sacramento. Somebody said that.
So air conditioning really is what made cities like Sacramento, as well as other hot cities like Phoenix, a place to move to. And trees were still valued for their aesthetic appearance and for the design, but not so much for their cooling properties. They were a little less appreciated then and began to be seen a bit of a nuisance as the landscape started to get flatter and flatter and wider.
One of my principal aha moments was 1956 when when the highest demand for energy in Sacramento switched from wintertime heating to summertime cooling because of mass number of air conditioners that have been turned on since post-World War II. And we've stayed in that ever since. And I love to ask the question, how many trees do we need to plant? How much increase in tree canopy cover to reverse that back? And can we do that?
And the timeline, it does seem to be that the invention of air conditioning did come into place with the decrease in terms of tree planting. I don't know that I've read anything that really substantiates that further than kind of what we've assumed. But it does then make me kind of fast forward a little bit and think about the Tree Foundation and when we began our Sacramento Shade program in partnership with SMUD, right? And so that was because of Rancho Seco going down and closing it and this brainstorm of, hey, let's create a phantom power plant.
So the idea of a phantom power plant is really, I think, the idea behind Sac Shade, which is a program that is planting trees that are saving energy that would otherwise be produced by a power plant.
Well, not too long after that, you somehow, Ray, some of the others got SMUD involved in the program. And they were initially skeptical about it, is my recollection.
Well, remember Dave Foreman?
Yeah.
He had the vision too. Yeah.
Okay. Well, David came in, he had a lot of visions.
Yeah, right, he did.
But that was probably, in my judgment, the biggest leap in terms of expanding the scope of the foundation.
I believe it's a very worthy story of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, the Sacramento Tree Foundation, and their ratepayers. As most of us recall, it was in the late 80s that there was a people's initiative to put on the ballot to close, for the first time ever, a nuclear power plant in the United States that was up and operating.
Rancho Seco was the major political and economic issue challenging SMUD.
SMUD had a lot of problems at Rancho Seco. It had had problems most of its life. There was the light bulb incident where one shut down the whole thing because of a light bulb falling behind the control panel. There was another one where a switch malfunctioned, and it was the most serious nuclear accident other than 3 Mile Island as far as a shutdown was concerned in our nation because it went down so fast. It could have caused the walls of containment to become brittle and have a major problem here.
Everybody thinks the people voted against nuclear power, but the technical vote was that SMUD couldn't operate the plant. And we had an offer from the Duke Power Company and Electricity de France to take it over, and they were willing to pay Sacramento a bunch of money, but we turned that down.
And the time it passed, the question was, well, how is SMUD going to make up for the power lost when it's actually closed down in the next year or so? And then S. David Freeman came along as general manager, had a long history of working in energy with the President Carter's administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and he said the answer is clear and simple: it's conservation. We're no longer be a utility that grows the demand for energy. We want to be a utility that lowers the demand for energy. Extremely controversial.
And he was a major proponent of what we were calling at the time the conservation power plant.
Conservation power plant would essentially be how you save energy so that you don't have to actually use it, right? So if I don't need as much, I don't have to build more.
We were short of power here when Rancho Seco was shut down, and the real question is, how can you keep the lights on?
He wasn't here more than, I think, 3 months when we got a call from headquarters over at SMUD saying, Mr. Freeman would like to talk to you.
When I moved into this house, I noticed that I didn't need to run the air conditioner because I had this big tree shading the house. And it occurred to me that, it says, you know, and I made up this little poem. It went like this. It said, I think that I will never see an air conditioner as lovely as a tree. And I said, well, we're gonna make the trees an efficiency measure, just like a more efficient air conditioner or just like a more efficient refrigerator or just like insulation in the building. Let's think of the tree as an efficiency measure.
When you think of trees in the landscape as kind of mini air conditioners because they're shading buildings, trees reduce the air conditioning load on homes. And in the Sacramento region, that comes up to about 100 kilowatt hours a year that's saved by a well-positioned tree.
But that means we can't just plant them willy-nilly anywhere. We've got to figure out how to get homeowners to plant them in the right place. And I said, you know, do we have any resources that we could put to work to do that? And they said, no, but there's a tree foundation here. I said, well, thank God. Let's find out. And so we sat down with them and we found out that that's exactly the kind of organization that we would have had to organize if it didn't exist. And so we contracted with the Tree Foundation so that we not only planted trees, but we planted them in the right place and taught people how to take care of them so that they would grow. I mean, you know, you can get in an airplane and throw out twigs and plant 1 million trees in an hour and claim you've done nothing. But we focused on getting trees that would actually mature and become air conditioners.
This community, they lined up for the trees. We never had to market anything, not a word. It was all word of mouth. We had neighborhood plantings of 100 trees, 300 trees. People would go to a church parking lot, a school parking lot, a neighborhood cul-de-sac, a community center. And we'd bring out maybe 100, 200 trees, have a planting demonstration, distribute the trees out, and then stay in the neighborhood to help people get the trees planted correctly. And it was very, very, very exciting times. But a fascinating thing happened. While we were celebrating and high-fiving over here at the Sacramento Tree Foundation, a small nonprofit, saying, we nailed it. We got those trees in the ground. We're going for the next 475,000 trees. SMUD's over there pulling their hair out. What does this nonprofit think they are? They have no inventory. They have no human resource department. They have very little checks and balances, you know. They're just out there planting trees. We want them to be here for 10 more years. And so they could have left us right there saying, we're not ready for this kind of big, bold initiatives and instability. But instead, they actually hired an outside consultant to do an organizational assessment of us. And then we really began to grow as a complete and full nonprofit that could handle the growth as well as the diversity of projects that we do today. That's because of the tolerance as well as the faith in us that was demonstrated by S. David Freeman.
And so I often think about that hat and that man and what would have been if it wasn't him sitting in the seat at SMUD at that time.
I think of all the things that we started at SMUD back in the early 90s, it may be the longest lasting program that they've had and perhaps maybe the most important.
The program is one of our oldest programs. It's 27 years old. It was started in 1990. Since its inception, we've planted close to 600,000 shade trees here in the Sacramento area.
The Sacramento Shade Program is the nation's oldest, largest, and most successful energy-saving shade tree program in the nation.
We found the essence of the urban forest, which was people and stewardship. Stewardship and people. People need trees, people need tree canopy. The tree canopy needs people to steward them.
You know, things start little, get bigger, and that's probably the important message of the Tree Foundation.